Zhang to a friend lost in the Tibetan War. Last year, you were sent to garrison Zhuezhi. Soon the whole army was destroyed below the walls. Now, with the Tibetan border sealed, no news comes. Are you dead or alive, wandering that distant land forever? No one was sent to bring back the abandoned tents. A few horses returned with torn flags we couldn't make out. I would have a ceremony for you, but what if you are alive? All I can do is shed tears for you, lost at the end of the sky. So, today's poem is, we have a new poet today, Zhang. Now, there are two Zhang in this anthology, each of them represented with one poem. And the transliteration of their names in Romanization, in Western script, is the same, even though in Chinese the Jis, the Changs are the same, but the Jis would be different. They're different characters and different tones. So this Changji, we can call him Changji 1 to differentiate him from the other one when we encounter the other one. This is a mid-Tang poet. He was an acquaintance and a friend of poets that we've already encountered, like Liu Juxi or Han Yu or Meng Jiao. So, Bai Zhuji, I think. In fact, in Han Yu's last days, when he was dying, Zhang accompanied him. He is therefore a mid-Tang poet. He mainly produced his work in the first quarter of the 9th century. He was especially famous for his ballads, for his Juefu poetry. He wrote ballads with social criticism, imitating the ballads of old. Most of his famous poems, even though he only wrote 70 that have been preserved that are in this style, they are his most famous poems. And allegedly, he influenced Bai Yuji in the development of the Shinjuefu, of the new ballads that Bai Yuji wrote, which were, examples of this sort of Confucian poetry of social criticism, attacking the rich, the merchants, the generals, who oppressed the poor people, the peasants, the workers. So, what else can we say about Zhang? He had a not too successful career in office, probably mainly related to a physical impairment he suffered from early on. He had sight problems and he became almost completely blind from a relatively early age. He still managed to get some minor positions in the central administration. So, after going from the biography to the person, Changji here is writing a poem on a new topic compared to the ones we've been reading lately, warfare, which is quite adequate. It matches his stereotype as a Juefu, as a ballad type poet, even though this is not a ballad, this is a pentasyllabic regulated poem. But if you remember some of the ballads we've read in the past, a lot of them were about wars. Sometimes, especially they were very generic, very abstract about unspecified wars, but others were pretty specific. This one is pretty specific. So this one is about the Tibetan wars that took place in the 9th century, for the most part. The topic of this poem is loss. It's not strictly war, it's war plus loss in war, basically the loss of a friend. So the title really sums it up. There are these wars taking place in the western frontier. A friend of Zhangji's has disappeared. We do not know, he doesn't know, if the friend was made a prisoner or if the friend has died. So very sad poem full of tragic pathos and uncertainty. Just a little bit of background on the Tibetan wars. So during the time that the Tang dynasty was flourishing, a Tibetan empire also flourished for the most part. And it was quite a strong and powerful empire, even during its high tide. The Tang dynasty, had some tough skirmishes and combats with the empire and wasn't altogether successful. After the Anushan rebellion, of course, China was left in an even weaker position, and the Tibetan Empire managed to to snatch lots of territory from the Tang, and in fact, they even managed to sack the capital at least once, or even more than once. So these Tibetan wars, were a big problem in the West. They cut China out from Central Asia and the Western protectorates, and they took a lot of territory in the West. China was eventually saved in a way from this pressure by the fragmentation of the empire. So during the late Tang period, the Tibetan Empire fragmented into I don't know, I think many polities. I'm not an expert on the topic. But China was spared from a further threat from Tibet for the remainder of its history. So we have these gruesome wars in the West that are debilitating and that are one of the elements that contribute to the incapacity of the late Tang to muster up its strength again and recover. War, remember, is always this is a loss, a personal loss of a friend in a war. But remember, war is never treated in Chinese poetry in an exultant or epic mood. It's almost always treated as a tragedy, whether a collective tragedy or an individual tragedy, as in this case. And also it includes, probably not in this poem, but in other poems about war that probably Zhang wrote, it includes also an element of social criticism, because the ones who really suffer in warfare, apart from the populations that experience warfare taking place near them and who suffer the attacks of the barbarians, are the soldiers, the conscripts, who for the most part are just peasants that have been enrolled in campaigns, and they have to spend long years of service, in the best of cases, when not dying, in a remote frontier. Okay, then let's go on with this poem couplet by couplet, as we usually do. Last year, you were sent to garrison Jueji. Soon the whole army was destroyed below the walls. So as usual, the first couplet presents the situation for us. In the last year, this friend of Zhang's was sent with an army to the west. And the army was annihilated, completely annihilated. One thing I don't quite get here is the impression this couplet gives is that Yuezhi is a city that was garrisoned by Changji and the army, and that just below its walls they were defeated. My impression from reading another translation is that Yuezhi here is not so much the name of a city or a fortress or a military camp in the West. Rather, it's an archaic name for the Tibetans. So the Yuezhi were a nomadic people that lived in the west of the empire during the Han Dynasty, that is from 200 BC to 200 AD. I think in the Eastern Han, from 0 to 200 AD. But of course, in Chinese poetry and in Chinese history, it is very typical to name contemporary threats, contemporary adversaries with the names of traditional enemies, traditional adversaries of the same sort of type and geographical location as previous adversaries of previous ages. The Byzantine Empire and the Romans tended to do the same sort of thing. For the Byzantines, for example, the Muslim Caliphate was generally referred to as the Persians, as if they were the previous Persian Sassanid Empire that had battled with the Byzantines for hundreds of years. So I'm not sure if this is a translation mistake or anything, but I think Juechi here probably clearly referring to the Tibetans. So this would be more like, last year you were sent to garrison against the Tibetans, against the Jueji. Soon the whole army was destroyed there, perhaps below the walls of a camp. I'm not sure if the original mentions below the walls. Okay, next couplet. Now, with the Tibetan border sealed, no news comes. Are you dead or alive, wandering that distant land forever? So, even worse than defeat is uncertainty. Not only was the friend and the army defeated, no news are coming from the border, and Zhang does not know if his friend is dead or alive, which is doubly frustrating. Not only is it painful for a friend of yours to die, it's even more painful for you not to know if he's alive or dead. Because, if he's dead, it's painful, but, you can start the mourning process and, the psychological steps that will take you to overcome grief at loss and death. But if the person has disappeared and you have no further information, the grief just the solving of the grief just gets postponed. So Zhang is at a loss. He doesn't know what to do, to take measures with respect to his friend as if he had died, or to still wait in hope of his eventual return. Perhaps he has been made a prisoner by the Tibetans. This is the main idea that is hammered in, focused on through the remainder of the poem. Not so much the war and its consequences as the possibility of death or survival for this friend. No one was sent to bring back the abandoned tents. A few horses returned with torn flags. We couldn't make out. So the third couplet just expands the second one. The second one just gives the general message. We have no news from the Tibetan frontier. We don't know who is alive or dead. The third couplet makes this more concrete, more visual through images. Basically two images. Horses returning back, so their riders have been killed or fallen, and but their torn flags. So we imagine they would have flags indicating their regiments or perhaps the people who rode them. They're broken beyond recognition, so we can't really know whose horses they are. And so there's this image of horses with broken flags returning, and there's also this image of abandoned tents that have been left in the frontier and no one has recovered. These objects that are unrecognizable or that lie in the frontier act very well as metonymies for Zhang's friend himself, who is also in the frontier and of whom we do not know anything, and who is not retrieved, has not been recovered, whether as a live person or as a dead body. Finally, the conclusion, which again hammers the point of in Zhang's doubts about what to do, what to think, and his sadness at the situation. I would have a ceremony for you, but what if you are alive? All I can do is shed tears for you, lost at the end of the sky. So if Zhang's friend were proclaimed dead, if Zhang Yi knew that his friend was dead, he would at least be able to make a funeral service, a memorial service in the memory of his friend. But he doesn't know, so he can't do that. The only thing he seems to be able to do is cry and laments that in the faraway frontier, lost at the end of the sky, his friend or his friend's dead body is lying there. So, quite a nice poem. Well, of course, the topic is not nice at all, but you get what I mean. I think it's quite a decent work of art. It seems to transmit some genuine feeling, so it feels less, how could we say, less trivial or less superficial than the typical poems of friendship, of parting or of meeting. It has a greater depth, in that it does seem to be echoing some real feeling, some real suffering on Zhang's behalf. But again, remember, this is a Western perception that privileges genuine emotional feeling as opposed to socially correct banter and interchange in poetry. But quite a nice poem, quite a nice, sad poem overall.